Welcome back to my Surrogacy Options podcast. I am very excited that we're joined today by Cindy Wazza from Hope Springs Fertility Law. Cindy, hello.
Hello, how are you?
Very, very well. All the better to have you on the podcast today. So you are based in Canada and you specialise in fertility and surrogacy. Tell us a little bit more about Hope Springs and the services that you offer.
Absolutely. It's such a pleasure to do this. First of all, welcome to Hope Springs Fertility Law in beautiful, sunny downtown Toronto. We are very well located with the subway system right across the road there. And I am the founder of Hope Springs Fertility Law, which is essentially the largest fertility law firm in Canada, but we're still very small, which is nice. So the largest firm here is 5 people. I have an associate lawyer who works with me and does a lot of what I do, a senior law clerk, an administrative assistant, and my office manager. And we work as a team, so everyone has access to a client's files. Everyone can assist a client when somebody is tied up, for example, right now. And we actually have clients in the office right now with their new baby signing documents to get home.
And we're hopefully going to get a chance to talk to them a little bit later about their experience of surrogacy in Canada. Tell us a little bit about the legal position for international intended parents coming to Canada for a surrogacy journey.
Certainly, Canada is a fantastic place to do surrogacy, especially for international people. We are more than just a tolerant society. We are actually an accepting society, which means here in Canada, if you're 18, you can become a parent. The law does not distinguish between your sexual orientation or your gender or your marital status. So, birth registration, which is a provincial jurisdiction, is determined by the place in which the child is born in the many provinces. And each province has its own laws about how and when you register the birth. In a few of the provinces, there must be a genetic connection between one of the parents, but in some, like here in Ontario where I am, you don't even need a genetic connection. The law basically says that a surrogate must be 21 and one cannot pay a surrogate or a donor in Canada. So we have what's known as altruistic surrogacy. And so when you're looking at a difference between Canada and the US, I like to say we are so much the same in many ways in terms of safety and healthcare and stability, but Canada also has some differences, which is the altruistic versus the commercial model for surrogacy. Surrogates here do things from their heart, and they can be reimbursed for their expenses, but no compensation is allowed. There has been some new developments in the law with respect to what is a legal reimbursement, insofar as the federal government has just published a list of regulations which actually codifies what we have been doing all along and says very clearly these are the acceptable reimbursements now. But in addition to that list, they've published what's called a guidance paper, which says no one can predict every situation. And so if something develops that is unforeseen and therefore not on this list, and it is reasonably related to the donation or the surrogacy, it should be acceptable, making it a very favorable climate, again, to do the surrogacy. We also have universal health care in Canada, which means the surrogate's medical care will be covered by the government of the province in which she lives. And even if the fetus requires extensive treatment in vitro, that will be covered by the surrogate's health care. Once the baby is born, it is its own person and it is entitled to its own health care. But that is based on residency. So a foreigner would need to purchase newborn health insurance to cover the baby's health care from the time it's born until it leaves the hospital, which will also cover just catastrophic care. If the baby is born healthy, they usually only stay 1 day, and a hospital bill is received for a very nominal amount considering the amount of health care that is received. And so the parents would pay the hospital directly. At this time, what we see is anywhere between 1 and 3,000 Canadian dollars for 1 day stay. But we would like foreigners to purchase newborn health insurance to cover anything that is more serious than a 1 day healthy stay. In addition, we have very good laws for the birth registration, as I've indicated. That is based on the various provinces, but generally in most provinces, foreigners would receive a birth certificate within 2 to 3 weeks of the birth of their baby. And in any major city, they can obtain the Canadian passport for their child within 1 day and then go home. Here in Ontario, we probably have what's considered the most favorable birth registration process, in that the law recognizes the intended parents as the legal parents essentially at the time of birth, and they register the birth. And many of my foreign clients are able to hop on a plane and return home with their bundle of joy as little as 14 days post-birth, up to 3 weeks. So many people love coming to Ontario for their surrogacy.
That's great, thank you. And one of the questions, perhaps we'll have a bit of a walkthrough of the end-to-end legal process for a journey in Canada, but one of the questions that we get asked very often is how quickly can we leave, and you've covered some of that there. Is there anything that IPs can do to be prepared ahead of the birth, if you like, to make the post-birth process easier, quicker?
Oh, certainly. We like to be retained at Hope Springs at around the 20 to 25 mark of gestation. There are 2 methods for birth registration in Ontario, and in many provinces just the one method. So the traditional way is the court order, where the lawyer goes to court and asks the judge to sign an order that declares that the intended parents are the only parents and that the surrogate is not. A great deal of paperwork is issued for that court order, and several copies of it. So it's really important to retain the lawyer early on, particularly because sometimes we have premature births and we don't want to be rushing and creating more anxiety having the legal work done while the parents are concerned about the health of the fetus and of the baby and the surrogate. So if we're retained early, we have everything drafted in advance, and then we just add in the birth information. In Ontario and British Columbia, there's a second method of obtaining registration, which is administrative. This is called a statutory declaration. And there's far less paperwork, it's more streamlined, and of course it's less expensive if you can do it, which is perfect for those in the UK. The statutory declaration in Ontario cannot be signed until 7 days post-birth. During that time, as I've said, the parents are recognized as the legal parents. They have their baby, but they sign the paperwork with the surrogate on the 7th day. So for that, we also like to be retained early on, so we have everything organized and pre-drafted, and then during that 7-day period, we just add in the birth information and send it to everybody to review and schedule the appointment to sign.
Okay, so we've perhaps started at the end of the journey. If we can go back to the beginning, obviously there's the issue of finding the surrogate through an agency or otherwise, and then contracting, etc. So give us a bit of an overview of the legal elements of a journey.
Sure. So in Canada, it's important to understand that there are 2 contract services the lawyer can perform. One is that between the parents and the egg donor, and the other is, or the sperm donor, and the other is the parents and the surrogate. There is no mandatory legal obligation to have an egg donor or sperm donor contract, although it's a very smart thing to do. The surrogacy agreement has become mandatory in various ways. For example, to do the administrative birth registration order in Ontario, there must be a contract that was signed by the surrogate and the parents prior to the transfer. Both parties must have had independent legal advice requiring 2 lawyers, and the contract must of course state that the intended parents are to be the legal parents. So by virtue of the statute, the contract has become a legal requirement to avail oneself of that administrative process. In other provinces, a judge will be reluctant to grant an order if there was no contract. They likely will because it's in the best interests of the child, but there would have to be further evidence or affidavit evidence from the surrogate and from the parents explaining how they understood their legal rights. So the contract becomes something that the judges want. And whenever one goes before a judge asking for an order, it's a good idea to give the judge what they want. So we like to see the contract in place prior to the transfer. On a non-legal basis, clinics in Canada require that a contract be in place prior to doing the transfer. That's best practices for the medical community. So they actually ask the lawyers to send them a letter confirming that the surrogacy contract has been signed by all parties. And most clinics will not begin to develop the protocol for the timing of the transfer until they have that signed letter from the intended parent's lawyer. So for that reason, the contract has essentially become mandatory. And of course, if one is working with a good agency in Canada, they will insist that there be a contract in place.
And then the next step from a legal point of view, presumably, is the post-birth phase, which we talked about before.
Yeah, and at Hope Springs, there are these essential 3 legal services: the 2 types of contracts, the post-birth registration. But we look at this very differently. We look at it as a holistic approach to care and guidance for our clients. A lawyer is the person who has the client's back at all times, looks out for their best interest. That's our ethical obligation. And when it comes to this field, it goes beyond just advising, as I might in a commercial buy and sell agreement, of the financial obligations. With surrogacy, it's about ensuring the well-being of the client, who's the intended parent, and thinking about the future of the child. So we like to be retained very early on in the process. There are no additional fees with that, but we like to be able to give you guidance and assistance from the very beginning, choosing the surrogate, looking at the profile that the agency provides, to talk to you about the province and how long the birth registration process will be in that province, looking at the financial obligations and making sure you understand things like employment insurance benefits in Canada, which most Canadians don't understand themselves, let alone foreigners. So we want to make sure the intended parents, who are very excited and anxious and perhaps a little desperate and vulnerable at the time, understand what their obligations will be in the event that there is a problem. We also want to talk to them about having wills in place prior to the transfer, because if, God forbid, they both die while the surrogate is pregnant, that fetus will grow and continue, and we need a guardian here to come and take the baby and register it in the names of the parents. I am happy to say, before I freak everyone out, that we've actually never had that happen in about 30 years, but we want everyone to be prepared for it. So there are a number of good reasons to talk to a lawyer early on in the process and retain them. With foreigners, there's an additional element. It is what happens when you take the baby home. It's really important to have advice locally. So for the UK clients, we like to refer them to a lawyer in the UK who will say, when you come back with your baby that's born in another country, you have to do something to become legally recognized as parents. And we want you to know what that is before you start the process here. Essentially, I want you to be fully informed, to understand everything that's ahead of you, because it reduces anxiety and panic and helps you make better decisions.
You're based in Ontario, and clearly IPs and surrogates are all over Canada. What if an IP is matched with a surrogate who is not in Ontario? Can you still help them?
Oh yes, we do that all the time. So we have no problems with providing that initial advice and drafting the contracts and getting them to the point of completing the surrogacy contracts. If the surrogate is in another province, then when they reach that 20 or 25 mark, we're going to introduce them to a colleague that we've worked with closely, that we trust, that will do a great job for them and help them get home as safely and securely as we would.
Okay, so that'd be a local, a lawyer local to that province.
To that province, correct.
You mentioned at the beginning some of the changes in the law around expenses and guidance as to what is an acceptable expense. I know you've been very active in trying to get sort of legal reform around surrogacy. So perhaps give us an insight into some of the things that have changed and where you think legal reform is going to be going in the future.
I'd love to talk about that because that is truly my baby in this field. As you know, and some do, I'm a mother through surrogacy as well. I met my husband at 42, and I was told that I was already too old to have children. So we made our two beautiful children, Etta and Janelle, through the assistance of an egg donor and surrogates. And when I went through the process, I was a criminal defense lawyer here in Toronto, and I had no idea about surrogacy. I learned it all through the internet as it was, because there was very little information, and through the lawyers that I retained. And when Etta was finally born, my lawyer said, well, I'm going to court now to have you declared to be her mother, and this would be in the family court, which I was a stranger to. And I said, but I don't understand this. I am her mother, and I'm married to her father, so why does it matter? Why do I have to go to court? And she said, well, that's how it's done. And so I said, well, that's going to change. And it has. And so we have this statutory declaration process now, as I explained, which recognizes the parents immediately at birth, which is what they deserve, particularly as we go through so much to get there, as you know. And I'm really proud of that change in Ontario and British Columbia. And I feel that it will develop in other provinces as a matter of priority, because every government is busy with other things. I don't think there's a moralistic issue that's blocking it so much as time and cost. The other area of reform is how and where there is a court declaration process, how it happens. In some provinces, the lawyer has to actually go to court and appear in front of the judge and have the order issued. And this is time consuming and therefore expensive for the intended parent. In some provinces, the lawyers have been able to just drop off the package at the court office, and the judge signs it as the judge sees fit, and the lawyer is contacted to come pick it up. And in Ontario, we were having to appear in front of our judges. So some time ago, I called a meeting and I said, why do we need to do this when in other provinces they don't? And we saw that change as well take place in Ontario. That means that I'm not spending half a day at the court, and I can pass that savings on to my clients. In some provinces, although a genetic connection is required, such as in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, DNA itself is not required. It's done by affidavit evidence. But Ontario, where the genetic connection was not required, our judges were demanding DNA not to show who the parent was, but to ensure that the surrogate was not. And we never had a situation where we really had anything happen where the surrogate was the parent. So I also asked if the judges could agree that DNA was not required, which is an added expense and also took about a week to obtain. So the judges agreed to that, and unless the situation is such that the lawyer has some concern, or the parents have some concern that the surrogate may be the parent, DNA will not be generally required in a court-ordered process. And then the final major area of change in the law is the Canadian-wide one, as I spoke to, the regulations. The federal government has undertaken to review all of the legislation and procedures relating to surrogacy and fertility in general. And one of the things that they wanted to do was promote and publish this regulation. So there are a series of regulations. One has to do with safety of sperm and ovum, which is very medical and technical in nature. And then the big one was regulations related to what expenses could be paid to surrogates and donors or reimbursed. So those are the two major reforms. Those regulations will actually come into force next June 2020, but in my submissions I asked the government to ensure that there was a very long period of leeway, of warning, so that we would be able to incorporate those provisions in contracts that would take place and continue through the enforcement date, because initially they said they were going to have them enforceable immediately. So I was really very involved with the health department. Health Canada is in charge of creating those regulations. I went to Ottawa several times to have meetings with the policymakers and the minister's assistants, and met with ministers. And then when the first draft came out, I was called upon to provide submissions, which I did. I sent submissions with a group of other lawyers. We did it all together as an ad hoc group, and I sent my own submissions, and went back and forth with Health Canada as they asked me further questions until we got to the final version, which just came out a few weeks ago. So now those are being incorporated in our contracts so that everyone knows they will be enforceable next June.
That's absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much, Cindy, and thank you for giving us all that great information. I can hear in the background our next guest, who are some of your clients over from Australia.
Right.
I think you said. I will let you introduce them.
Thank you. They're just going to make their way into their office. So this is a really beautiful story. So many of them are, but this one's very interesting. Chris and Liam very much wanted to become parents, and they were matched with a lovely woman as a surrogate through Canadian Fertility Consulting. And there were numerous transfers that failed, and then their surrogate offered to be what's known as a traditional surrogate, which means that she would carry their baby using her own eggs and through an artificial insemination process. And the owner of Canadian Fertility Consultants, Leah Swanberg, called me and said, if ever there is a situation where we know this will be safe and sound for your clients, it's with this particular woman. So we organized it. We wanted full psychological assessments done, and the transfer occurred. There was success, and the product of their journey is in my office today. She's about to become the legal child of her parents. And the other part of the story is that while all this was going on, one of their sisters agreed in Australia to act as their surrogate. So they also had a little boy. And so the four of them are here in my office, and they agreed to say hello today and let everyone know. Family dreams can certainly come true. And it's real, and Canada's great. So here they are.
Squeeze in.
I'm going to
We have to kneel down. Hi.
We've got Chris and Liam and
Hello.
the beautiful Elliot
And
our
then
newborn
here
gorgeous
is baby Gwen. She's sleeping, which she does a lot of the time.
Well, that is newborns for you. It doesn't last long, I can tell you.
They say.
Hello.
Hi. So, Liam, Chris, thanks so much for popping on last minute.
Pleasure.
Tell us a little bit about your experience of being international IPs in Canada. Some of the highs, some of the lows. How did the process go for you?
Where do we start? It's been a long journey. I think 5 years ago we connected with Cindy and Leah via this exact same sort of method at a conference in Melbourne. So highs would definitely be, to me, connecting with Nikita, who's the wonderful, amazing rock star woman who helped us finish our family. And it's been a really unique and special relationship from our point of view with Nikita.
Yeah, I think it's become for us an extension of our family now, which is really lovely to have sort of a family in Canada as well. It's become a lot more organic than we sort of first thought it would be. There's a lot of stories we hear where it's very contractual because the IPs want it that way. However, we were sort of really seeking something a little bit more, a bit more organic, a bit more
personal. Yeah.
Personal, that's right. So we're really pleased with the outcome. I mean, it's been a long, rocky journey, but to get where we are now is magic. So,
and I think what sort of reflecting on how the lows can contribute to a high, we had 4 failed IVF transfers with Nikita, and then a miscarriage for the 5th attempt. So Gwendolyn's actually our 6th attempt, and even though that was, they were the real lows for us, but through that, she stuck by us, and through that sort of shared hardship, we really built this really beautiful relationship where Chris said, she's now family for us, and her extended family are our family, and it's, it's just really, really beautiful. So had it worked first time, I'm sure we would have still, been really close, but the hardship has definitely made us stronger. So they're probably the highs and the lows.
Yeah.
Thank
Is
you.
there any way to describe an altruistic surrogate better than this?
Absolutely is.
Her heart.
Yeah.
I don't know that I can give this baby back.
There's laws about that in Canada, I'm sure, Cindy.
Oh, you can have this one. He ain't sleeping at the moment, so you can have him.
We can explore Toronto
having been through the process now and with a beautiful daughter, what advice do you have for international IPs coming to Canada?
I would say, like when we first started, we were quite naive, and we were sort of we went through this thing of like, when would be the best time in our lives to get pregnant and then for the baby to be born, so it fits in with my holidays as a teacher. And we had this really naive concept that we'll lock in these dates and get the pregnancy done and the baby out during this period of the year. And I think my advice when I've been asked from same-sex couples back home, sort of like what's your first off advice, I would say you've got to, if you're thinking about it, act sooner rather than later, for sure.
Yeah.
Because you may think it's a quick process, and for some couples it really is, and it's amazing, but for others like us, it can be a 5-year journey. So I would say get on that boat quick, smart.
And I guess sort of ties into us being here with Cindy. Find your advocates within the people that are working with you and supporting you, and then don't be shy to go to them. And if you do have a really genuine, supportive relationship with those people, nurture that relationship because you need them. And, they're professionals, they're there to do it for you. And also there are some people in the surrogacy world that, maybe more driven by the business decisions rather than the personal stuff. So the good ones cling to them and ask for help. Yeah.
Wonderful. Liam, Chris, thank you so much for talking to us. Very, very many congratulations on the expansion of your family. Cindy, we will be seeing you in next week, I think it is, in London and in Dublin at our events there. Thank you so much for your words of wisdom and all the information today, and we look forward to seeing you then.
All right, we'll see you soon. Thank you so much for the opportunity to help.